Hey team, so about a year ago, Matt Walsh released his kind of terrible propaganda piece, What is a Woman? I made a video response in which I argued that Matt used manipulative tactics to make his progressive interview subjects look dumb for his documentary. To honestly mixed results. From my perspective, Matt's the one who looked kind of dumb in most of those interviews. One of these tactics was to ask really complicated questions, not allow his subjects to explain their answers, and rely on the fact that his audience is ignorant enough to not realize that what the interviewee said was actually right. For example, this moment in the Michelle Forcier interview.
Male gametes. That's what makes me male.
No, your sperm don't make you male.
Then what does?
It's a constellation.
In reality, in truth, okay?
Whose truth are we talking about?
The same truth that says we're sitting in this room right now, you and I.
No, you're not listening.
In my first video about the film and book, I said,
To be fair with Matt, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really understand what Forcier means when she says it's a constellation. I wished Matt would have asked her to clarify what she meant by that, rather than thinking to himself, that's a good soundbite, let's move on. So I decided to do some digging on my own to try and understand where Forcier is coming from a biological standpoint here. I found an article that I think maybe clarifies what she meant.
But the research I did into that particular subject was, in hindsight, a little bit inadequate, so I'm going to revisit it today, especially because the Daily Wire released the film for free on Twitter for Pride Month, so it's easier and cheaper than ever to be lied to.
In reality, in truth.
In reality and in truth, biological sex is really complicated. Since last year, I've come to understand why experts say things like, it's a constellation or it's a spectrum in regards to sex. But it's hard to explain, so I went looking for a visual aid to help me. You might have seen this graphic, which a graphics editor for Scientific American created to visualize the complexity of biological sex determination on a spectrum. It's a good graphic. A great graphic even, but let's be honest, it's not exactly immediately visually intuitive, which means that people can glance at it and look away before they have a chance to internalize the truth that it holds. I wanted to create a graphic that accurately demonstrates the complexity of biological sex, explains what is meant by constellation, and is immediately visually intuitive. So I chose a visual language we're all familiar with. The Apple iPhone settings. All right, let's build this thing together. Keep in mind that I'm not a biologist, just a student who took a gender studies class because Matt Walsh's movie didn't actually teach me anything and I wanted to learn more. I did get an A on the sex and gender quiz though, so you could say I'm an expert. The dominant cultural narrative has long been that there's two sexes, male and female. But it can't be that simple because intersex people exist. So we have to at least create a category for them, right? But in 1993, American sexologist Anne Fausto Sterling published her article, The Five Sexes, Why Male and Female Aren't Enough. In it, she argues that the best way to categorize human bodies is with a five-sex system, not with a two- or three-sex system. Male, female, and intersex, as well as male-leaning intersex and female-leaning intersex. She gave the five sexes names: male, merm, herm, firm, and female. These names never caught on, so I won't be using them. And even within her own paper, Fausto Sterling admits that the five-sex system she's proposing is limiting as well. She writes,
On the basis of what is known about them, I suggest that the three intersexes, herm, merm, and firm, deserve to be considered additional sexes, each in its own right. Indeed, I would argue further that sex is a vast, infinitely malleable continuum that defies the constraints of even five categories.
So this infinitely malleable continuum might be better represented by a slider, but this is vague and unhelpful, right? Like, it doesn't actually tell us much. Definitely doesn't tell us what constellation means. Not to mention, Fausto Sterling followed up her 1993 paper with The Five Sexes Revisited in 2000, in which she writes,
It might seem natural to regard intersexuals and transgendered people as living midway between the poles of male and female. But male and female, masculine and feminine, cannot be parsed as some kind of continuum. Rather, sex and gender are best conceptualized as points in a multidimensional space.
And that's what this is, right? A continuum when we need multidimensional points in space. Maybe Matt Walsh can help. What was it he suggested made a person male or female?
Male gametes. That's what makes me male.
Gametes. Okay, let's start there. Usually gametes are tied to gonads, right? So on the male side, we've got testes, which produce sperm, and on the female side, we've got ovaries, which produce eggs. But it's not that simple because not everyone with testes can produce sperm, and not everyone with ovaries has eggs. They're not directly tied, so we need to separate them and also include an option for the production of no gametes. But it's also not that simple either because it's possible for a person to be born with a testis and an ovary. This is what we would usually call true gonadal intersex. It's rare, but it's possible. We also have to complicate it a little more because it's possible for a person to be born without clear testes or ovaries, but instead streak gonads, which we might classify as being ambiguous. I'm also going to put egg production and sperm production as on-off switches for simplicity's sake. It's unclear to me whether any person has ever actually been able to produce both sperm and egg, but given the vast diversity of humankind, it certainly seems possible, especially with the advancement of modern medicine. At any rate, it's clear that gametes alone don't make someone male or female because some people don't produce either. And you can't always just look at the gonads to clarify the sex because those can be ambiguous as well. What else in that case might indicate sex?
How do you know that you're a man?
How do I know that I'm? I guess because I got a dick.
Oh my God.
Okay, let's talk about genitalia. This one's obvious, right? There's
Dick and cock.
and,
Coochie.
but of course, it's not that simple. Nearly all genital structures in males have what are considered homologous structures in females, and vice versa. Structures are considered homologous when they have similar embryonic origin. Male and female human fetuses are indistinguishable until about 9 weeks, when they start to develop in one of two directions. So homologous structures are structures that were the same thing before that sex development began. The homologous structure for the penis in females is not the vagina, but the clitoris. The homologous structure for the scrotum is the labia. And if you want to include the vagina and the uterus, the male homologous structure is what's called the prostatic utricle. What is a prostatic utricle? I'm glad you asked. According to Wikipedia, it's
A small indentation in the prostatic urethra at the apex of the urethral crest on the seminal colliculus, laterally flanked by openings of the ejaculatory ducts. It is also known as the vagina masculina or uterus masculinus.
So, yeah, I don't really understand that either, but I include it to demonstrate how complex the genitalia are. I could, in theory, create a category in my settings for all of the different homologous structures, but that would get way too complicated way too fast. Like, here's Wikipedia's list of homologous structures in human genitalia. I can't include all of that. Instead, I'm going to follow the lead of scientists who, when aiming for accuracy and simplicity, separate genitalia into two categories: internal and external. But of course we can't just leave it as male and female because ambiguous internal and external genitalia exist as well. Some people are born with a penis and a vagina. Some people are born with a clitoris and testicles. We at least have to include an intersex option for both internal and external genitalia. With this in mind, it becomes obvious that genitalia alone can't be used to determine whether a person is male or female. And if their gonads and gametes are also ambiguous, what else can we look at? We could always look at hormone levels. And this one's easy. Men have testosterone and women have estrogen, right? But actually, we all have both. Males tend to have higher testosterone levels and lower estrogen levels, while females tend to have higher estrogen levels and lower testosterone levels. So we'll separate estrogen and testosterone into two separate categories, and you can choose whether you have male or female levels of each respective hormone. But some people's hormone levels fall outside of what is considered normal for a male or female. So we have to include an intersex option again, right? But I don't think visualizing hormone levels like this makes any sense because it's medical professionals who decide where male hormone levels end and where female hormone levels begin. Nature doesn't care about the categories we've built. It just creates people with different hormone levels and we place them into categories. So I think it would actually make more sense to place testosterone and estrogen levels on sliders instead. And of course, this is an extreme oversimplification of the human endocrine system, but these are the two hormones we usually tend to talk about when we talk about sex. So I'll just add an other section for simplicity. This slider for the hormone levels has got me thinking about genitalia again. Okay, what I mean is, just like the categories healthy male hormone levels and healthy female hormone levels are medically constructed, could we not say the same thing about genitalia? Like, At what point does an enlarged clitoris become a small penis? At what point does a fused labia become a scrotum? At what point does a prostatic utricle become a vagina and uterus? Like, these are questions many people are asking. Very important questions. Many people are asking these questions. No, but really, who decides what size an enlarged clitoris has to be before it's considered a penis? It's medical doctors. It's not biology. It's humans. Which is why I think it makes more sense to visualize genitalia on sliders, just like hormone levels. Sure, most people's sliders may rest comfortably on one side or the other, but that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of people who exist in varying places in the middle. But wait a minute, back up. There's something I haven't touched on yet. Biological sex is determined by chromosomes, right? You've heard Matt Walsh say this one. Every cell in your body has XX or XY chromosomes. Every single cell in your body is either male or female. You can't go against that. But like everything else I've already talked about, it's not that simple. Sure, most people are born with either XX or XY chromosomes, but there are also people born with XYY chromosomes. People born with XXY chromosomes, XXX chromosomes, and XO chromosomes. So if you can't determine someone's sex by their chromosomes, you might have to look at their hormone levels. But that can be ambiguous, so you might have to look at their gonads or gametes. But those can also be ambiguous, so you might have to look at their internal or external genitalia. But those, again, can be ambiguous, not to mention the ways these categories can appear to contradict each other. People with XY chromosomes can appear entirely phenotypically female otherwise. People born with XX chromosomes can appear entirely phenotypically male. And what's this at the bottom of the screen? Secondary sex characteristics, which include facial and body hair, breast size, milk production, voice pitch, fat distribution, muscle mass, Adam's apple size, and more. In reality, in truth, what we call biological sex refers to all of these things together. Chromosomes, hormones, gonads, gametes, genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, this constellation of characteristics. Any attempt to pinpoint one specific factor that categorizes all individuals as either male or female will ultimately fail. But reinforcing a rigid sex binary is important to so many people because it's necessary to justify a patriarchal hierarchy. It always comes back to the patriarchy.
Oh my god, is that the patriarchy?
Let's talk about the word binary for a second. People often say that sex is a binary, right? Which would mean that every person can be placed comfortably into the category of male or female. But of course we know that's not true because intersex people exist, so we could just create an extra box in the middle to put intersex people in. But then the question becomes, at what point does the category of male end and the category of intersex begin? Where does the category of intersex end and the category of female begin? Like, how high of testosterone levels does a female have to be before she's considered intersex? How small does a male's penis have to be before he's considered intersex? The truth is that it's humans to decide how to define these categories. Most people do fall comfortably into one of two categories because human biological sex is, rather than being a binary, what we would consider bimodal. Nature sort of aims in one of two directions when creating humans, but the result is that plenty of people fall naturally somewhere in between. And where the lines that separate the categories are placed is entirely up to humans. I'm not saying that the categories of male, female, and intersex are useless. Sex categories can be incredibly helpful, but just because they're real and useful doesn't mean that they aren't also, in part, at least, socially constructed. This brings me back to Anne Fausto Sterling's The Five Sexes. Why did she write in support of expanding our sex system to include 5 sexes anyways? Well, because the binary sex system was having a material impact on the quality of life of intersex people. For many, many years, being intersex was considered a medical condition that required correction. If a child was born with ambiguous genitalia, the doctor would recommend surgery for the infant, even if the baby was entirely healthy and the surgery was purely cosmetic, which is often the case with intersex births. Let that sink in. Babies were undergoing unnecessary and dangerous surgeries to make their doctors and parents more comfortable with the appearance of their genitals. And it continued to happen until some of these intersex people grew up and started fighting for the rights of the intersex babies that would come after them. Intersex advocates have been making big strides in ending the practice of conducting cosmetic surgeries on infants. but the recent wave of anti-trans bills being passed in many American states is setting them back. Many of the bills banning gender-affirming care for trans youth specifically make exceptions for intersex people. Performing unnecessary cosmetic surgeries on babies is being codified into law by Republicans, and somehow it's the trans people that are the problem. This just goes to show that the trans panic was never about protecting kids from medical experimentation. It was always about reinforcing a rigid gender-sex binary to justify a patriarchal hierarchy. Intersex people are more common than you might think. About 1 to 2% of the population is considered intersex, which means around the same amount of people are intersex as have red hair and are transgender. And while some types of intersexuality may be associated with medical problems, more and more people agree that intersexuality itself should not be considered a medical problem or a disease. It's just a normal part of the biological sex spectrum. But the biological sex spectrum is problematic to people like Matt Walsh because the simplicity of the answer to the question, what is a woman, and he's always reiterating how simple of a question that is, relies on the simplicity of the definition of female. If the answer to the question, what is a woman, is an adult human female, the question then becomes, what is a female? Matt Walsh would have you believe that this is also a simple question and that intersex people don't actually complicate it that much. That everyone, including intersex people, is either male or female, and that intersex people just have a condition that prevents them from fully embodying their true sex.
Intersex people have a condition that makes their biological sex appear ambiguous from the outside. That doesn't mean they have no biological sex. They are still either male or female. Nobody has ever had the functional sex organs of both sexes, which would be truly intersex.
This is laughably wrong, and I'll get to why in a second, but I think the reason he believes this comes from the book of Genesis.
So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Genesis 1:27.
If all people are essentially male or female, and intersex people just fail to fully develop into their true biological sex, then Matt Walsh can just call that a result of the fall of man, a consequence of original sin. Otherwise, he would have to contend with the fact that his interpretation of the Bible is wrong about the diversity of humankind, or he would have to accept the subtext that
male and female he created them. Therefore, intersex people are not made in the image of God.
Which would be even more problematic for him, because I don't think any Catholics are ready to accept the notion that 1 to 2% of the population is not made in God's image. But since Matt Walsh is so confident in his ability to determine whether someone is male or female, I think we better put that to the test. In his article, What is a Woman? Why the Left Can't Answer the Question, Matt Walsh writes,
what is a female? Well, a female is someone with XX chromosomes, a female reproductive system, female gametes or eggs, and the ability in principle to ovulate and bear offspring. There are females who suffer from illnesses, injuries, or malformations, or who simply are postmenopausal, which prevent them from bearing offspring.
So, according to Matt Walsh, a female has XX chromosomes, a female reproductive system, female gametes, the ability in principle to ovulate, and the ability in principle to bear offspring. I think the in principle language is pretty interesting. What he means by in principle or by nature is incredibly vague and extremely unhelpful when you start getting into the weeds of actually trying to categorize intersex people into male or female. But he insists it can be done.
Sounds like we've established there are some people who in principle can get pregnant, and there are some people who can't. So there's two categories, otherwise known as binary.
Lots of women can't get pregnant either.
Yeah, but they're still of the nature to get pregnant. The only
but
reason
they can't get pregnant.
Yes, but
truth matters, right?
It does. That's what I'm trying to explain to you.
Truth matters, and they can't get pregnant. That's the truth. So how are they still women?
A woman by her nature can get pregnant. A man by his nature never can.
But what does it mean to be of the nature to get pregnant? When someone tries to pin him down on this, he usually follows with the following story.
There are females who suffer from illnesses, injuries, or malformations, or who simply are postmenopausal, which prevent them from bearing offspring. This does not make them any less female. It is instead an exception that proves the rule. Here's why. When a female cannot bear children, we know that something has prevented an otherwise natural process. But when a man cannot bear children, we know that it is not a sign of anything having gone wrong, because men are not supposed to bear children, and no man in history ever has. If, as a woman, you go to the doctor and tell him that you are unable to conceive children in your womb, he will run some tests to figure out why, because a reason preventing normal childbearing exists. If, as a man, you go to the doctor and tell him that you are unable to conceive children in your womb, he will run some tests to figure out what's wrong with your mind.
Have you spotted the problem yet? According to Matt Walsh, a female is a person who has, in principle, the ability to get pregnant. And you know that a person, in principle, has the ability to get pregnant if she is a female. Who's resorting to circular logic now, Matt? But that doesn't matter to Matt. He has a patriarchal system to uphold. So if I, and like every credible scientist, would visualize biological sex distribution like this, then Matt would visualize biological sex distribution as something like this. I've chosen to depict his model of sex distribution as an unconnected Venn diagram, not just because I love Venn diagrams personally.
I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles. And yeah, I see people that you agree with me, right?
But because that's how he's described it in the past.
I don't think it is an exception because, as I said, I think a true resident of the middle circle of the Venn diagram would be someone who has the reproductive capabilities of both genders. And no one like that exists. I mean, not to be crude, but there isn't anyone who can get themselves pregnant, right? So I don't think, I think what you're talking about there are people who have deformities, and so in their case, it would be more difficult than usual to determine what their actual biological sex is, because the usual indicators aren't there, or aren't as obvious. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a biological sex.
You agree with me, right?
Again, this is laughably wrong, and I'll demonstrate why by charting some hypothetical intersex people on my handy biological sex settings graphic. So the average intersex male's constellation looks something like this, and the average intersex female's constellation looks something like this. Intersex is an adjective that essentially just means not intersex. It's used to describe people who fit comfortably into the category of either male or female. So these are your average intersex constellations. Kind of boring if you ask me. Intersex people's constellations are way cooler. Here's the settings for a hypothetical person who has what we call Turner syndrome. They have one full X chromosome and one partially or fully missing chromosome. They have ovaries and, like many people with Turner syndrome, had a normal amount of female gametes during gestation, but lost most or all of them before birth. I've indicated this by turning on egg production, but graying it out. They also have internal and external genitalia of the average female. If I were to actually ask Matt Walsh, I have a feeling he would probably say that yes, this person is a female, because they have the ability, in principle, to get pregnant. Still unclear what that means, but they still don't meet the criteria he laid out earlier because they don't have XX chromosomes. Okay, but what about a person who is born with XX chromosomes, but has testes that don't produce sperm, and the internal and external genitalia of the average male? Is this person a female? Do their chromosomes indicate that they can, in principle, get pregnant? The penis might get in the way. Okay, what if that same person's external genitalia is more ambiguous? Are they female now? What about if they also have ambiguous internal genitalia and ambiguous gonads? Are they female yet? Is this person by their nature able to get pregnant? What about them indicates that? I'm so confused, Matt. These aren't impossible hypotheticals, by the way. Everything I'm showing you, to the best of my knowledge, are real combinations that people can naturally be born with. Those last three constellations I showed you all represent people who would probably be diagnosed with what we call XX male syndrome. Okay, but what about a person born with XY gonadal dysgenesis? They're born with XY chromosomes, but ambiguous gonads and internal genitalia, and with the external genitalia of a typical female. So they have XY chromosomes, but would most likely be assigned female at their birth because of their genitals. Is this person female? Or how about a person with androgen insensitivity syndrome? Androgens are what we consider the male hormones, so a person insensitive to androgens might be born with XY chromosomes, testes, and have hormone levels of the typical male. But because their bodies don't respond to androgens, which I've displayed by graying out the testosterone slider, they have ambiguous internal genitalia and external genitalia of the average female. Again, despite the XY chromosomes and despite the testes and typical male hormone levels, this person would probably be assigned female at their birth. Is this person a female, Matt? How do we tell if they can get pregnant in principle? What does that mean? Oh my gosh. I'm actually gonna lose it. What does that mean?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
It doesn't mean anything.
What do you mean?
it means Matt can't come up with a better argument. Like, where do we put these people in your disconnected Venn diagram? Can you see the problem with Matt's model of sex distribution yet? There are plenty of people, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of women walking about living their lives as the females they were told they were since they were born, but who, according to whatever random standard Matt Walsh has, should actually be considered males with an intersex condition. And to top it off, because Matt believes that sex and gender are inseparable, and living as a gender different from your biological sex is immoral, all of these women must now be forcibly transitioned into men. That is the natural conclusion to Matt Walsh's logic here. If you still don't believe me, indulge me for just a little bit longer. I'm going to map a few more different intersex people on my chart. Here's the constellation of a person with what we call 45X, 46XY mosaicism. They have some cells with only one X chromosome and some cells with one X and one Y chromosome. Is this person a male or a female? You might say male because they have testes, more masculine external genitalia, and can produce sperm. But what if their gonads are ambiguous and don't produce sperm? Are they still a male? What if their external genitalia is more feminine? Are they still a male? Okay, what if the person with a more feminine genitalia was assigned male at birth, and the person with a more masculine genitalia was assigned female at birth? What then? This isn't just a hypothetical either. This example is based off of real people. While researching for this video, I found this study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2012. I was looking at these tables in the study to get an idea of how to chart 45X, 46XY mosaicism on my sex settings graphic. The tables include information such as whether the patient had scrotal fusion, a micropenis, and the location of their gonads. They used this information to calculate the patient's external masculinization score. The paper includes two tables, one for the female patients and one for the male patients. You may be saying, oh, this proves Matt Walsh's model. There may be intersex conditions, but scientists know everyone can still be separated into the categories of male or female. But then you may notice that several of the patients labeled female have a higher masculinization score than several of the patients labeled male. So I went ahead and reordered all the patients by their external masculinization score. In the case of a tie, I just went by patient number, which means in the case of a tie between a male patient and a female patient, the male patient will be listed as more masculine by default. Of the 25 patients in the study, the female patient with the most masculinized body was listed as more masculine than 3 of the male patients. And the male patient with the least masculinized body was ranked as more feminine than 4 of the female patients. And the least masculinized male had a score that tied the 3 least masculinized female patients. So naturally, my next question was, if they all have the same chromosomal combination, what makes some of these patients male and some of them female, if not the masculinization of the body? The answer may surprise you. In the patients and methods section of the paper, the authors write,
a final group of 25 consecutive patients with a confirmed karyotype of 45X46XY mosaicism were included in this study. We divided the patients into 2 groups according to the gender of their rearing, 18 males and 7 females.
The gender of their rearing. So what makes one of these patients male and the other female is the sex that was chosen for them by the adults that were in the room the day that they were born. Quite literally, the only reason that patient 20 is labeled female and patient 6 is labeled male is because of the sex that they were assigned at their birth. This is one reason why trans activists use language like sex assigned at birth. Not just because it's more inclusive, but also because it's more accurate. Patient 20 has a body that is, in some ways, more male than patient 6. But we call her a female not because there's some specific immutable biological factor that makes her one, but because that's what the doctor and or parents decided for her when she was born. So while this column of the chart is labeled sex, would it not be more accurate to label it sex assigned at birth? And what about patient 9, who was assigned male at birth but has a uterus? A uterus, by nature, exists for pregnancy, right? So can we not say that this male person can get pregnant in principle? If so, does that make him a female? And if it does, according to Matt Walsh's logic, does that not mean that we have a moral imperative to transition him into a woman? This is a major problem for Matt Walsh's model of biological sex distribution. Because again, he would either have to admit that the strict categories of male and female don't include all human people, Or he would have to argue for a specific way of classifying all intersex individuals into one category or the other, forcibly transitioning thousands of cisgender intersex people in the process. Also, this is one study of 25 individuals with one specific type of intersex condition. There are dozens of categories of intersex and countless variation within those categories, not to mention the variation that exists within endosex populations. Biological sex is complicated, very complicated. Like Michel Forcier and Anne Fausto Sterling said, it is best represented by multidimensional points in space as a constellation. It's definitely not a binary, and if sex isn't a binary, then the biological essentialist view of gender espoused by the likes of Matt Walsh cannot be supported. And if biological sex is this complicated, don't even get me started on gender. My nails, well, I painted them and it took like an hour and a half and they look kind of bad, like don't look too closely, but yeah, they took like an hour and a half just for my left hand, so no shot I was doing my right hand too. So this is what we're working with today.